I want to thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Asher, for coming too. And I'll just talk just for a second, because I don't know enough about this topic to introduce it properly. But like so many things happen in my bookstore, people come in and pick up a book, and it's easy to start a conversation. And I realized with Asher that happened about 25 or 40 times, like of books that and we were both interested in. And then I was playing some music, and he knew things about the music, and I realized that we had he knew a lot about a lot of things, and that I always like that. You know, that's a good trait. And we found some things we could argue about, so that's good too. And then Asher does a lot of public speaking, and he can tell you a little bit about that. But I figured it would be interesting. We talk, well, what could we speak about? Would he like to do something here? And I suggested the topic of the environment and climate change, and that was a good suggestion. I think he was ready for that, and has talked a lot about that, and knows a lot about that. And my sort of desolate opinion is that things are almost couldn't be worse, and maybe we don't have very long to live as humans, or maybe there's a mass extinction. And so in my brief conversation with Asher, was maybe one of the few times I had a glimmer of hope that there wasn't, so I don't know if I was setting you up there, okay. But that was one reason that made me want to hear that there were some possible things that humans could do to get themselves out of the fix that we've made for ourselves. So maybe with that, thank you very much, and I'll sit down, and thank you, Asher. Thank you for coming, and
thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. Yes, I do try to walk a tightrope over the abyss between irrational exuberance and rational optimism on all things technological. And so that's my background. I've worked for years as a technology futurist. Starting many years ago, I was at the National Policy Center for Public Policy and Social Thought in Jerusalem, Israel. And most of my policy work was looking sort of at the global sphere of things. And I've been a chief technology officer. I've been a chief innovation officer for startups. My last consulting gig before I returned to Vermont 3 years ago, because I grew up here and took a 20-year hiatus, was in Brazil. So I never sort of trained my attention on Vermont-related issues, and I've been doing that of late. We started an organization, a friend of mine and I, a couple of years ago, called Vermont Future Now, and we've sort of been addressing 5 key areas that we speak about. And being a futurist, it's the future of those 5 areas. So we talk about the future of jobs, future of energy, future of healthcare, future of education, and future of government. Those are the big ones. And I do speak all over the world on these kinds of topics. I was just down actually in Providence, Rhode Island, giving a talk on artificial intelligence. And I've of late, though, been sort of staging these types of events throughout the state. And we've been very interested in having better political conversations about these types of things. Having spent a lot of the legislative session over the last few years in Montpelier, kind of on and off, I see that there's this growing gap between what politicians know, both on the national and local level, in terms of the adjacent possible, let's say, in terms of futurist studies and what's actually being implemented. And it's sort of interesting to see, and partly is because you're so busy in your practice or in your work or in your legislative activities, when do you have time to research this stuff? I probably read 6,000 to 8,000 science and technology articles a year, and I don't even scratch the surface. It's so vast, and even while I'm having this conversation, the picture is changing because it's so incredibly vast. So an outgrowth of that, over the summer we had 3 interns who unfortunately weren't able to be here today, college interns, and we set up something new. We're calling them Thought Co-ops, and you can find us on Facebook as The Thought Co-op. We've been trying to engage Vermonters, and this was sort of spurred by a article I read in Wired magazine that sort of assessed all 50 states based on how vitriolic the commentary was on political news sites when you opposed whatever opinion was being aired there. And it went state by state by state, and Vermont was #1 most vitriolic. So I don't know if people are bored in the cold of winter and taking out their aggression because they're freezing on news sites or not, but I sort of grew up, I grew up in Brattleboro. I thought we were the laid-back state, it kind of live and let live. You don't bother me, I won't bother you. It shocked me, frankly. And I saw Vermont as sort of a microcosm of what's going on in the nation. I thought, as many have said, we need a campaign to sort of depolarize America and break down some of these silos that are occurring and echo chambers as a result of new rules for new media and social media exchange, where you're just hearing more of what you already think. I was sort of raised that it's a good thing to speak to people who think differently from you, that you're going to gain from that engagement, and you'll change each other in a kind of mutual way, and things will evolve very positively. But that's not the environment that I've seen in recent years so much, and especially even on university campuses that are supposed to be like the forerunner for like open thought, a sort of free market of ideas happening. That's sort of been less and less the case. And so without advocating any particular idea, I just thought it would be good if we had, let's say, liberals and conservatives and everywhere in between speaking to one another. So we started doing these thought co-op exchanges. We just had one last week in St. Albans. It was on immigration, clearly a hot button topic of late. And before that, we did several in Burlington. We had on guns and gun control. We had one on the minimum wage. We did one in Manchester on the legalization of marijuana. And just the idea that it's not a debate. You should come and have a conversation about these things. We'd love to perhaps do one of these kind of engagements here in Woodstock, but we figured we had to kind of be known first before we could come in and do that. And the format for those exchanges is like sort of weeknight bingo replacement in the form of political speed dating. So you sit down and you find partners who think differently from you, and the more different the better, and you have a 7-minute conversation. And then you have 3 minutes to fill out like one of these sort of Uber-style review forms about your interlocutor, and ask questions, or rather respond to questions like how thoughtful and considerate they were, how much you learned, how good was the conversation, and then you do that 6 times in an hour, and we gamified it, so we hand out prizes at the end. And that's been the format that we've had. And it was very interesting. We had UVM students at one of the first ones on gun control, and a bunch of people from the NRA that were there too, and they had never spoken to one another before. It was really, really interesting. But because you've been set up that you're not coming at someone with the tip of a spear in debate form, where you're going to skewer them and the kill or be killed kind of attitude, this is more, as I've been characterizing it, like a bouquet setup. And a bouquet is like there's this great distribution of lots of thought threads that are kind of complementary if we get them all together, and some are on the right, some are on the left, maybe some are in the middle. Let's see what we can do with this, because it evokes hospitality in terms of the conversation that we've been having. When we have a smaller group, or a sort of initial contact like this, and we're trying to do this in all 14 counties, we'll pick a topic, and usually I'll present, or we'll have someone present for a period of time, which I'll do tonight, and then we kind of open it up for conversation. But conversation in this spirit of openness and hospitality to different ideas, and it should be educational as opposed to argumentative and debating. Because many people sort of like cower in the corner if you come to a talk like this, and maybe you feel like you might be the one person in the room who doesn't buy into climate change, or maybe you are super into climate change and you maybe worry everyone in the room is not into climate change. Everyone feels they can air their opinion because it's sort of better to hear what people really have to say and then have a meaningful conversation about it. And almost in every case, people have walked away saying, you know, I really learned something. This broadened the scope of what I was thinking. And maybe even if I didn't change my view, I might have a better way of communicating my view to someone who doesn't already think like me. So that's sort of the background of what we are interested in doing. And in my own background, I sort of am a generalist. I'm a lighthouse, not a laser beam. So I'm very interested in interdisciplinary studies. I've taught at the college level interdisciplinary studies, so it can range from art and architecture, music and poetry, to film theory and design and architecture. It could range to quantum mechanics and biotechnology, and how are all those things sort of connected, deeply interconnected. So I'm an interdisciplinary type of person, and I'm more interested today in presenting trends, thoughts about the environment, thoughts about what we can do to respond to environmental issues, and not getting into the specifics. So I will try as best as I can to omit, for instance, the names of companies, because I'm not here to promote any particular company or specific technology, but this is sort of like approaches that are having. And I want to start by framing the issue of the environment and climate change and all of these deep concerns that many people have today with a specific framework that I think will provide some optimism, especially if we connect to it in the right way and don't allow it to become passive. Sometimes if you hear the news is too good, you just sit on your hands and don't do anything. So we have to have that strange sort of paradoxical attitude where, yes, things could be really, really good, but no, we can't just stay passive. We need to very actively engage them at the time. And so this has to do with sort of the age that we're in and how technology is changing. And this will give us maybe a different set of lenses for predicting where things might go in terms of energy and its impact on the environment, in terms of other forms of pollution, how we might clean up the environment, how we might even learn to hack the environment. And hacking is sort of a very hipster term today. You talk about computer hacking, you somehow get into the source code and you can change the applications of what your programs do. So that's been exported into the realm of life coaching. So we talk about life hacks, how to reprogram your microbiome so that you have better digestion, gives yourself more energy and better sleep, or how you use exercise to enhance your overall fitness. These are all insights into what we might call life hacks. And we're talking about hacking everything today. We use that language. And it could be hacking government with ingenious ways to deal with seemingly intractable problems in government. And it could be hacking the environment itself. Is there like some sort of source code for understanding the environment? If we have a degree of virtuosity for knowing how to read it and write it and edit it, can we really transform the environment in pretty radical ways? And I would submit to you as a thesis that we are starting to be able to do that. We're like in the nascent stage of that, and it's unlike any other time in history. In fact, in general, we're at an utterly different time in history. It was not too long ago, for instance, that the amount of information that was generated from the dawn of civilization to the year 2005 was quantified by Eric Schmidt of Google. And he said that basically if you were trying to wrap your head around that in terms of data storage, it would take about 5 exabytes of data storage to take the totality of everything produced, all the newspaper articles, the photographs, the movies, the books, everything up from the dawn of civilization till 2005, 5 exabytes of data storage. And you might be scratching your head and wondering, well, what exactly is 5 exabytes of data storage? It's like 50,000 years of Blu-ray video streaming continuously, or about twice as much as the average teenager watches over summer vacation. So it's a lot of information, an immense amount of information, up until 2005. He further then predicted by 2010, because of sort of the acceleration that we're experiencing in technology, we'd be producing 5 exabytes of new information every 2 days. And in fact, that occurred. We got to the point where 5 exabytes was being produced every 2 days. And then he made a further prediction by the end of 2014, 2015, we'd be producing 5 exabytes of new information every 10 minutes. And we do. In fact, we don't even use exabytes anymore to describe how much information there is in the world. We're in a whole nother scale, a whole order of magnitude above that. We talk about zettabytes of information, and soon we'll be in yettabytes of information. These are astronomical numbers. So if you want a visual, I don't know how much time you spend at the beach if you live in Vermont, but if you were to try to imagine every grain of sand on Earth as a bit of information representing a 1 or a 0, the amount of information we expect to be creating in 2020 will be about 75 times the total number of grains of sand on Earth. So these are just almost staggering things. Even in the sciences, 90% of the sort of knowledge that we have and information generated compared to all human history has been generated in just the last 2 years. And this is almost incomprehensible how this could be the case, but this is sort of what's been going on. It's been fueled by remarkable connectivity that we've had in the world. We see even as of 2015, 2016, there was about 8 billion, internet connected devices. By 2020, that'll be 50 billion internet connected devices, because your toaster oven and your coffee maker will also be connected to the internet. And by 2030, we're looking at 1 trillion internet connected devices. All this is important, again, for framing where we are today and what's possible that maybe wasn't possible in the past, because more is different. And the future is not just necessarily a repetition of the past. There's something emergent now that is so strikingly different. So I grew up in Brattleboro, Vermont. I remember at the Grace Cottage Hospital in Townsend, Vermont, there was Dr. Otis. And Dr. Otis, I used to think when I was a little boy, was like 200 years old. And he had one of those black bags with the stethoscope. And in my estimation, he probably had in his mind the totality of medical knowledge when he went to med school, probably back in the Dark Ages. I don't know exactly where it was. And his response to any injury or ailment was simply to tape it. That was sort of like how he would deal with all things, you know, or take 2 aspirin. It was very simple then, it wasn't complicated, and everything fit right in that bag. And in fact, in 1950, which is when he was really like, you know, early on in his practice in Townsend, the medical knowledge in the world was doubling every 50 years compared to all human history. Well, by 2020, we anticipate that all medical knowledge will be doubling every 72 days compared to all human history. And you may say, how on earth is that possible? How is it possible that it should be going that quickly? Well, you may have heard of the Human Genome Project that was started in the 1990s, went for about 13 plus years, cost $3 billion. It was an exceedingly expensive thing. In fact, they got halfway through this project and only 1% of the human genome had been mapped. And there were editorials saying it's just a total waste of money and time. It's going to take eternity to ever get there. In fact, we predict if 1%, this is the key thinking here, we predict if 1% of the human genome took 7 years and $1.5 billion, then it's going to take another 693 years to finish the other 99%. Right? Doesn't that make sense? Just a simple extrapolation, what you already know from the past, extending it into the future, and it will be like $1 trillion if we ever even get there, right, to do this. And that's just for mapping the genome of a single person. Right? Very, very difficult to wrap your head around. What people didn't appreciate when they made that prediction, however, was every year we were doubling the amount of the genome we could map and cutting in half its cost. So the price performance was getting better, and the speed and efficacy at which we could map it was accelerating, following this beautiful exponential growth trend. And if you're doubling every year, and you're at 1%, well, how many more years does it require then from 1% till you get to over 100? So in less than 7 years, they reached 100%, and the cost came down. They finished not only on time, but within budget because of this acceleration. Today, it's possible to map a human genome in 1/20th of a second. What took almost 14 years and $3 billion can be done in 1/20th of a second for less money than it costs to flush a toilet, frankly. And that's what's generating this massive amounts of information. It's really, really important to have this as context. But over and over, we make sort of false assumptions of where things might be, because we tend to think linearly. And if I take 30 linear steps, I might be 30 meters down the road. But if I do 30 doublings, I'm at 1 billion meters, assuming every step is 1 meter, right? So it creeps up on you. At first, it doesn't seem so pronounced, but eventually it changes in quite profound ways. So part of sort of a futurist's job is to kind of look at these trends to see like the history of bad prediction, and even the current bad predictions that are made on politicians, like thinking that it will take 50 years to get rid of oil or something like that, which is a ridiculous prediction in my view. And part of it is because it doesn't appreciate the exponential pace of technology. It just extrapolates into the future using a linear model, or maybe there's little incremental progress year after year. And this has been a problem not just for governments, not just for politicians. It's been a problem for business as well, which frequently make inaccurate assessment of things. Back in 1980, in fact, AT&T did a study of cellular service. And as you might imagine, these brick phones that you had for cell phone, and they were pretty cumbersome and expensive, right, back in 1980. And they were trying to know, and they asked McKinsey, the consulting firm, to predict for them what would be the market for cellular phones in the year 2000. What do they think that sales could possibly be, peak sales for the year 2000 back in 1980? And they suggested that they thought it would be 900,000 units sold in the year 2000. And they were correct. 900,000 units were sold in the year 2000 in the first 3 days. So their estimates were way, way off. And of course, now we know that there are 7.6 billion cell phone hookup lines worldwide, even though not that number of people, because there's actually more lines than there are people using it. But it's the equivalent of 1 line for every person. The world population is 7.6 billion. So it's accelerated at this alarming rate. And the adoption rates increase in every area, and we're going to see how this works with energy as well and environmental things. If we go back to something like the telephone, how long did it take for 50 million Americans to adopt this wonderful technology of the telephone? I still remember in Newfane, Vermont, my grandparents having a party line when I was very young, right? How long does it possibly take to get a telephone? 50 million people adopting it. Well, it took 75 years to get to that point. Long period of time. And so we tend to fall back on what we're used to from the past. Didn't that take a whole long time for people to get that? And that's why we are consistently off when we look at the future. Well, what about radio? Radio took 38 years to reach an audience of 50 million people. A little bit faster. How about television? How long did it take television to reach 50 million people? 13 years till you had 50 million television viewers. How about the web? Once the web transitioned to being like a public thing and not just a private military research thing, it hit 50 million people in 4 years. And most excitingly, and perhaps most relevantly, Angry Birds was downloaded by 50 million people in just 31 days. So go figure, right? The ability to adopt new tech is itself accelerating at ever faster rates. And that sort of changes and reframes everything that we see in the world today. And we see this, for instance, in solar energy. Much of the time I see these stats like, well, we'd like to be at 30% solar energy by 2050, 2060, 2080, like all these like very distant numbers. And we don't know how on earth we would get there. Like how are we going to get to this point where solar could be that pervasive? And so going back to 2003, there were sort of these predictions, like what would we get at sort of like peak output per year? How much solar could we deploy? And the response back then was 1 gigawatt of solar energy could be produced. Well, they weren't even right for that year, but this year alone we'll put in 104 gigawatts of solar, minimum, maybe even more, for 2018. So they're off. They thought that would be the peak world capacity, and they're off by 104 times, and it keeps growing year after year in terms of how fast that can be deployed. So you have people like Ray Kurzweil, who's perhaps the most successful futurist with 30 years of predicting trends. He's one of many, and I'm not suggesting that everything he says is gold, but there are a whole group of us who kind of monitor his predictions over the years. I've been myself looking at them very closely going back to 2005. And he's very public about them. And he's got around a 92% accuracy rate on predicting stuff, because he understands both complex systems and exponential growth trends as they have. And that's why he was hired by Google. He's sometimes been dubbed the Thomas Edison of the modern age. Of the remaining 8% of his predictions, some of those are also correct. He just may be off by 2 or 3 years. So unlike most futurists, like the Jetsons, for instance, who thought we'd all be, flying around in flying cars, he's been a little bit more accurate on these types of things. And one of the things he's observed is that there's a great parallel in solar energy to what has occurred in the computer industry with computer chips, or actually before computer chips and integrated circuits, you had these vacuum tubes and punch cards and other paradigms. It seems like we keep moving forward and being able to do more with less. If you were to time travel back, I am a registered time traveler, and if you were to travel back to the 1960s and go to MIT, they would have a computer. It was bigger than this barn. It cost $11 million. It was $1,000 an hour to use it, and it was it's so primitive in comparison to everything we have today. If you go forward to about 2005, just that 40-year kind of time jump that you have is a billion-fold increase per dollar in computer capability. So basically $1 in 2005 is buying you like $1 billion worth of computer power back in the 1960s or 1970, thereabouts, right? And it's actually surpassing now about $1 trillion. So if you were alive back then, you now are a trillionaire. If you could just go back in time to the 1960s or 70s, you'd be a trillionaire based on just having a smartphone. And these smartphones are now millions of times more powerful than the computers that landed us on the moon. And they continue to grow at this alarming rate, right? How is it possible that you can have a computer today that will do in minutes what the fastest computer in the world would take 5,000 years to calculate just 10 years ago? So I bring all this out because it's very important to understand the notion of acceleration and the accelerating returns, and how each one of these innovations feeds back on itself and sort of gives us ever greater tools for making the next leap forward, because they really play into things like solar energy or energy in general and the environment in general. So Kurzweil noticed that Moore's law, which talks about this sort of regular doubling of the amount of transistors you could put on a computer chip while the price falls in half and the size shrinks, that happens with great regularity and has been doing so for decades and decades. There's something called Swanson's law, which applies to solar energy, and that's also been having an exponential growth curve over the last 3 decades. The price per watt has continuously fallen. The efficacy of the solar cells has increased, and the deployment of those cells has increased, all following an exponential trend. So much so that if you go back to 2012, you could see that 0.5, 1/2% of the world's energy was coming from solar at that point. And if you have basically you need to go to 2006 to 2014 and then 2016 to really see the trend, where it goes from 0.5% to 1% in 2 years and then 2%. And we're in the middle of the next doubling right now. And this has happened pretty much continuous. You can have little periods of ebb and flow where temporarily investment will kind of slide back. Oil will be at a low price. and solar won't be going quite so fast, but then it tends to make it up in the next great innovation going forward. So if you sort of chart the trends over time, it's falling in this way. To this end, Kurzweil was noted saying in 2016 that we are at a point where we could see solar handling all of our needs within just 12 years. If you're at 2% and you're doubling every 2 years, how many doublings do you need till you're all the way, you have 100% of your energy? And we get every hour more energy from the sun than the whole world uses in 1 year. It's about 10,000 times our planetary outuse of solar, which we measure in terawatts. I mentioned gigawatts. 1,000 gigawatts is a terawatt. We're in the like 18 to 20 terawatt range right now in terms of power usage. But even hitting that number, if the trend just simply continues the way it has been in the last 3 decades, solar alone could do it. Now, there's also human nature to derail ourselves. Like, it's also possible, never underestimate our capacity to get detoured along the way. But theoretically, it seems to be going that way. And it's being bootstrapped by all these innovations that are going on in other areas. And one of the areas that's most remarkable that's allowing us to hack the environment and really hack every major problem is artificial intelligence. And if you haven't followed some of the stuff happening in artificial intelligence, I'm now going to scare everyone, and you may want to like run out of the room and go off grid and hide somewhere in the Vermont hills, because it's stranger than fiction what's happening right now. Since I'm standing next to this wonderful piano, and I know some wonderful jazz is played upon it, I will mention that there has been a artificial intelligence / robotics project to create a jazz musician that can do improv. And this robot has been playing with a jazz trio and quartet. And if you're not watching, you actually can't tell who's the robot AI system playing. Yeah, it's like the Turing test. Yeah, exactly, for jazz. And it has no problem keeping up with the improv with the other players. So that's today. That's already happening today. In medicine, we now see that artificial intelligence can outperform some of our best cardiologists in anticipating when a person's likely to have a heart attack. In the hunt for exoplanets, looking for extrasolar planets, which are in great abundance, it turns out. A lot of real estate opportunities. We now think that there's somewhere between 8 and 40 billion Earth-like planets just in the Milky Way galaxy. So lots of opportunity for other environments that we can go mess up. Let's hope not. But that's sort of like expanding the horizon somewhat in terms of resources and opportunities. The data on that is so voluminous, and it's so painstaking for human beings to comb through it. Now AIs are doing it, and in recent months, an artificial intelligence system actually found 2 Earth-like planets on its own, unassisted, just looking at that data. Moving beyond that into the sort of everyday realm, from the heavens to the earth, we see that if you're a foodie and you like food and you're in a restaurant and you kind of want to know like what was in that dish, there's actually an app that uses artificial intelligence whereby you can take out your smartphone, snap a photo of the prepared food, and it will produce a fairly accurate list of all the ingredients that are in it just by looking at it. Moving beyond that, if you like the world of pop culture and movies and television, there's a AI system that actually maps out the narratological points in cinema and in television and looks for optimal places to have dramatic effects. It basically tries to pick when is the best time to evoke a cathartic experience and have people cry. How do you time it? So 21 minutes into the show, something has to happen to get people to cry, and you can actually map that with AI where it's more likely to have that psychological effect on your viewing audience. In certain other weird areas, we see that there are robots who can now read lips. AI systems that can read lips. So if you're watching the Super Bowl and the coach is sort of like covering their face, it's not just because they're worried about human observers. The AI from across the stadium could theoretically see what play that they're saying into the microphone. In China, They have a system and a program that's very much like the sci-fi movie Minority Report. I don't know if anyone here has heard of that, but they have in that movie the Department of Pre-Crime. They try to anticipate where a person is likely to commit a crime and then go and either stop you or catch you in the act.
We have that here too.
Yeah.
Feelings company, yeah.
Yep, and it's all over. China is really at the forefront of that. It's in America, it's in many places, and it's effective in trying to anticipate crime before it occurs and help that as a tool for law enforcement. These are just some of the great examples of what AI is doing. There is an AI system that is able to be the ultimate plagiarist. It can go into other computer codes and cut and paste things that it likes that it can't do and add it to its own program, all autonomously. So you start to wonder where that might go, right? If you're not scared yet, just you maybe want to listen more closely. It's like really unbelievable what all this stuff does. And then at Google, they have an AI that has begotten AI. There is an AI system that created the code for another artificial intelligence system that's better than itself and better than what the Google engineers were able to create. So these are like just a few examples, and it's important, again, framing. This is the world we're in right now, and it has really dramatic impacts. Now, where might this come into climate change or environment or pollution or energy, any of those sort of topics? Well, at Harvard, they have an AI algorithm now that is able to search through hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and soon billions of types of materials. It's all in the interest of pursuing materials science. Can search through those materials to look at their specific physical properties to see which ones might be better for solar energy or other types of energy efficiencies that we might have. And this new algorithm at Harvard is able to find those new materials, just doing it through computer modeling 10,000 times faster than what we've had previously. So we're not talking about like a little incremental increase like year after year. Like compared to last year, the search for like new materials for solar cells is potentially moving 10,000 times the rate of what we had before. And it's very important to understand that this also plays into the search for materials for batteries. Currently, some of the best battery designs that we have can compete in terms of energy density storage with gasoline. They're very close to that, but there's a growing feeling in the material science community that we are on the cusp of creating battery storage that could be a tenfold improvement over what we currently have today. And that can mean both the speed of recharging those batteries, which would be a clear tipping point for adoption, widespread adoption for automobiles, for houses, the density storage if you want to live off-grid or have something like solar supply your energy 24 hours a day, even when the sun's not shining, as it is not now, right? And it would certainly allow for advancements in robotics and in many, many other areas. And the hunt for that is now enhanced. And actually the tipping point was 2012. 2012 was a very big turnaround for the search for all these things. If you were kind of looking at what was available in the world prior to 2012, you might have had a different notion of how quickly some of this stuff might come about. And part of that is if you go all the way back from 2012 to 1955, it was actually at Dartmouth College that the term AI, artificial intelligence, was coined. And it's been a kind of a problem for that whole period of time because the first 50 years of artificial intelligence has all been rule-based. And imagine, like, it's hard enough to do it with teenagers, like, let alone a robot, right? Like, or a computer program. I need to program every single possible case and outcome and scenario with every variation and tell you what all those rules are. It's a lot like having a big tangle of regulation where you can't get anything done because you've just got too many rules and I can't proceed before reviewing all the rules.
That's not AI, that's rule-based.
That's rule-based, yeah. So the turn with AI, no, it's still like classified as AI. The shift is into what we call machine learning in 2012. 2012 we get a shift into machine learning, and then also deep learning, which is a kind of a subset of machine learning. That's much more similar to how we learn. So deep learning, for instance, I can just give you a ton of data. I don't even give you parameters, and you're just going to kind of figure it out as we go. Obviously, that's a crude example, but I'm not going to give a whole talk on deep learning right now. And this is being used all around us in many, many different areas, including the search for solutions to environmental types of issues. So all of this, I can't stress enough its importance in framing these things and trying to anticipate where we might go from here. I've mentioned solar. I've been a big sort of solar advocate for many years, and I got that way because I started thinking about this stuff when I was in Jerusalem in Israel. I was thinking about geopolitics in particular, and different geopolitical issues that go on in the world, and also like just looking at the absolute varying levels of technological deployment and technological literacy that were existing in the Middle East at the time. And I remember hearing this remarkable statement, which it turns out it was even earlier, said even earlier than I ever knew. It was said in the 1970s by the Saudi oil minister, and he said that the age of oil won't, like the Stone Age it didn't end for a lack of rocks, and the oil age won't end for a lack of oil. That was the essence of what he said. And that hit me. That was like the first time I started thinking about these things, because for so long it was sort of like, well, this is just so commonplace. We're never going to get around it anyway. I started thinking to myself, well, what would that do on a geopolitical level? You know, without making a judgment call if it's good or bad, it would change things, because there's certain economies in the world that are really not diversified, like Saudi Arabia's. They've tried to like kind of catch up with that in the world today. Ironically, Iran, which has one of the largest fossil fuel reserves there is very, very aggressive in the adopting of sort of new energy technologies. So go figure. Why would this be happening? It like didn't make any sense to me. So I started thinking into it more, and it occurred to me that alongside the narrative that we've had in the press that has been subject, like everything else, to political spin about climate change or global warming or the environment, whatever it might be, there are a whole range of issues with fossil fuels. And one of the things I saw that you could do to actually broaden the tent to get people engaged in alternatives to fossil fuels was to just paint the full range of reasons why that would be. Many people have like this notion that global warming or climate change is like the clear educational pillar over which everything must stand and like change must be made. And I'm not making a statement disputing that at all. All I'm saying is that you can actually join in a kind of bipartisan way a lot of people together when you start to paint a broader picture. So, for instance, having energy independence, having not to spend money making poor political decisions that prop up governments that maybe dictatorships. Maybe that's a reason. You know, there's a whole inventory of reasons, and the one that actually struck me as the biggest, that got me so infuriated by oil, went back to the first movie I ever saw in 1977 in the theaters, which was Star Wars. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to like be out there, you know, amongst the stars, going to that next level? And I'm sitting here all these years later, I'm disgusted by all the sequels to Star Wars, and we still don't have that kind of energy, right? What's going on? We're still sort of like on this antiquated 19th century technology that's no good. So like I literally can't see, once you paint this larger picture, how anyone, for whatever reason, could find a way out of not wanting to get beyond oil and fossil fuels. I think that it's important to highlight all of those reasons. We make poor political decisions, like they slow our economy. I actually found in my attic a thing my father wrote in the 1960s extolling the virtues of nuclear, wondering if that it would be, quote, as many people had said at the time, a power source that's too cheap to meter, and what that would do to global economic activity. Like, that would be amazing. Of course, it hasn't quite realized that promise, but it's also not entirely defeated also. Part of it is we seem to look at the past performance of nuclear and assume that that's sort of what the future performance will be like. And that seems to be a limitation in terms of our creativity, our design thinking, and our innovation. All of those should come along. So while I'm a big solar enthusiast, I like seeing innovation across the board in energy, as long as it doesn't pollute, it's going to improve the environment, it could be cheaper than anything we have before. And I even will add another category which I think is important for adoption, which is the aesthetic piece of things. And great strides are being made in all of those areas. So in nuclear, new nuclear, there's a lot of designs now for like little micro-nuclear reactors that are very efficient. Some of these things use like molten salt plugs, so they literally can't melt down even if all the human beings walked off the job. They have like this ingenious design element of them that the minute they start to heat up too much, they shut themselves down. It's not even a mechanical process. These are new types of designs, and while there's been a lot of disappointment regarding nuclear fusion, which has been another pursuit that a lot of people have sort of hyped, perhaps excessively hyped over the last few years, I believe success comes through failure, and I'm not the only one who said that. As a former head of IBM once extolled, he said, if you want to increase your rate of success, you've got to embrace failure. In fact, double your rate of failure to increase your rate of success. And there's been a lot of fails in the nuclear fusion range, but there's still some really exciting things going on in that sphere. One of the latest is actually led by a 25-year-old mathematical savant named Dmitri Hopkins. That's just got tremendous funding looking for nuclear fusion. So it's clear that there are going to be new things emerging on the horizon, that we're not simply going to have to make decisions and play by what we have today, but we suffer from what like perhaps cognitive scientists refer to as a status quo bias, that it's just going to be more of what we already have. And I think that these new areas of energy are certainly emerging in amazing ways. And every part of them is performing better. Solar, in many parts of the world, for instance, has reached grid parity. In certain parts of the world, it is the cheapest source of energy after 2016 to deploy. In certain parts of the world, between wind and solar, the day was so bright and windy that the energy rates went negative for the first time in the world. That's like the power company paying you to use power because they have too much of it. That's almost incomprehensible, I think, to most people, that we could create a situation where you actually have negative energy rates through the deployment of these things. If we look at the notion of grid parity, extrapolate it forward, if the same trend continues that has been going on in the last 3 years, many project by the early 2020s it will dip just about everywhere below grid parity, meaning cheaper than what you can get from fossil fuel generation on the grid. So the economic force alone will drive adoption to accelerate. That's one of the forecasts that is out there. And this is without subsidies. Yeah. Currently, you've had a lot of subsidies. Did you have a comment?
I mean, Bill McKibben talked about this in his article, Power to the People.
Sure.
All of that is true. The problem is that a lot of the fossil fuel companies have already bought mineral rights.
Yep.
And so they're not going to give up those mineral rights.
Yep, absolutely.
And also when you have that kind of dispersed power, these corporations lose their, so you've got this huge economic force saying, nope, can't do that. We need to burn fossil fuels. Yep. I kind of think the only way to really get to that part of solar energy is to just buy off the oil companies. Pay them back their trillions of dollars that they've invested, because that's really the only thing stopping full adoption.
So interesting.
But I got that from Bill McKibben.
No, I'm aware. And that goes back, by the way, to the taxis in New York City at the turn of the century, like the 20th century, where there were more electric vehicles on the streets than fossil fuel powered vehicles. There's a long history of exactly that occurring. However, I would submit to you that the river of innovation is so broad right now that it's very hard to block it in a globalized society. And there are other amazing things that even if your local government doesn't want to adopt it, and I personally tried to get a solar farm put in with some investors in Florida a number of years ago as part of a consulting project. And you had Florida Light and Power who was saying, oh yeah, we'll buy your third-party generated solar electricity and sell it through our grid. The only problem was they wanted to advertise that they would do that, but they would pay you actually less than you could possibly generate it for, and then they jack the price up, making it economically unfeasible. So there are all of those kinds of things that are games going on. And yet, again, innovation is incredible in finding ways around those problems. So one of the things that's going on right now with blockchain technology, which is sort of like the underlying thing for things like Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. Bitcoin is one of 1,900 odd things that use blockchain currently, and new are sort of like appearing and vanishing every day. And you just had a talk here, I believe, on crypto. But another platform that is perhaps even more apropos of this conversation is the Ethereum platform, which has something called smart contracts on it. Those smart contracts make a very easy, sort of frictionless way for me and you, no matter where we are in the world, to exchange things of value, or even like have like certain legal agreements to buy things without an intermediary, whether it be a bank, a government, or anything else blocking us. So there's currently a number of attempts to use smart contracts based on blockchain to allow, let's say, if I generate solar energy at my property and I want to sell it to you and I don't want to go through the grid, we can do that directly without having all these things in between. So we have some real power of choice that wasn't possible in the past. And that's just one effort. There are many like that that are happening today. And I think a lot of the big oil is realizing that the writing is on the wall. According to certain opinions, of the sort of $28 trillion of remaining fossil fuel reserves, some of it is extremely difficult to get to. Now, technology could improve to extract some of that, but some opinions say 22 trillion of it is unburnable. And whether that's true or not, it creates a kind of dilemma for the fossil fuel industry, even while the exponential pace of all these other things is accelerating out of sight. In fact, for the first time in recent years now, renewables have greatly outpaced fossil fuels in the deployment of new capacity throughout the world, especially here in the United States and places like China. It's amazing to see that for the first time. There's only a teeny sliver counts for what's going into fossil fuels compared to, let's say, solar or wind or others. We can lump others into that category. So this means more is fundamentally different. And it's not clear that you'll be able to see the same exponential cost curve occur in fossil fuels, making them economically viable. And my view is when we're at the tipping point where the economics without subsidies push it, the adoption rates skyrocket. And we've already seen in a year where we've manufactured and sold 1 billion smartphones, that the capacity to adopt and to manufacture at scale is here. You can really think about transforming the world that fast. And much of the developing world is leapfrogging the fossil fuels. They're coming online using these alternatives that are decentralized supplies of energy without having to go through the regular way. So I think the writing is on the wall. And actually that's what we observed at the National Policy Center, that a lot of Middle Eastern conflict is actually one of many factors. I wouldn't try to explain it away with economics, but one of many factors in the mix is this growing sense of concern over the retention of the bread and butter of so many OPEC nations. Namely that the fossil fuels, if you remove that, what will that do as a destabilizing force? What will that do in terms of political clout? What will that do in terms of any number of things in the world? I think we're in for some major changes as a result of that. And it's only starting to be, I think the problem's starting to be heated in some of those countries, but maybe not to the full degree that it needs to be. Now, there are other areas also when we talk about hacking the environment that I think are very interesting to note. Some of those have to do with, let's say, those islands of, I would say island, but it's really islands of floating plastic in the ocean. Mm-hmm. Besides, like sequestering carbon in the oceans, which heat them up and create problems for the aquatic life there, we find that there's all this floating trash going around, and we've tried to do behavioral modification, like tell people, do recycling and that kind of thing, but still only a small fraction of the billions of plastic bottles, let's say, that are generated in the world every year are actually recycled. A lot end up in the sea, and you've maybe seen the disturbing photographs of these types of things. What you may not know is that actually a couple of high school kids in Japan, these two young women, have actually picked up on a form of bacteria that will eat plastic and excrete, benign substances as a result of that. And there have been to date several other projects on the same level, whereby we can use forms of synthetic biology to reprogram these sort of like basic molecular machines that we have all around us to actually scrub toxins and to address issues that we've had in the world. In Vermont, I've actually been trying to speak a lot to different groups about the lake cleanup. And I say the lake, meaning Lake Champlain, but it's really the lakes, plural, also, because we have these algae blooms that happen. And there's been a whole question, is it from the farms? Is it when you have like overflow of sewage in St. Albans that goes into the bay in the form of millions of gallons? What exactly is causing what? How do you address it? And most of the tools for addressing it that have been described thus far are kind of like backward-looking tools that are prohibitively costly, and it seems like, oh, we don't know, we're never going to be able to kind of deal with this. Well, Lake Erie actually has pilot projects also using synthetic biology, where they basically toss these little modular robots into the lake, and they have these ingesters, and the ingesters like to eat the algae bloom. They like phosphorus. They consume it, they turn it into power, allowing them to swim to where there's more of it and eat that. And when they run out of it, they biodegrade. So you could start to imagine a situation where you deploy these things, and they're actually fairly inexpensive, especially when you do them on scale. Again, that wasn't a possibility a couple of years ago, and that's why we have to emphasize what's maybe coming in the forward, in the forward mirror, where objects are closer than they appear, as well as the rear view mirror sometimes. So a little bit of an optics game. That some of the stuff is here now, and it just needs to be scaled up, or if we put energy and effort into developing these things, they can be very good. And I have a number of questions that I want to get into the discussion piece on this, but yes.
Is it possible to sequester carbon that way? Is there like a robot?
There are actually a whole bunch of activities right now for sequestering carbon, a whole range of them. One technique requires like a power plant. So if the power plant that was used was a renewable-based power plant, like they've got it down to where they could theoretically do a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere for about $600, and they would like to get that down to $100. But yes, you could actually, there are at least a dozen approaches I've read about in just the last maybe year and a half that are looking at a range of ways of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and doing something useful with it. Again, if you just looked a few years back, none of it was all, a blank. That wasn't possible. And I question what new things are like lying out there on the horizon that are going to take us, to the next level beyond it. Because ultimately, we're in a world, frankly, that's teeming with energy. I always loved hearing the story of Richard Feynman, one of the great physicists of the 20th century after Einstein, and stellar bongo player as well. That Feynman once said that there's enough energy in a cubic meter of empty space to boil all of the world's oceans. Dealing with just the quantum jitters that happen in a vacuum. So forget selling the Brooklyn Bridge to someone. We can sell you empty space and exploit maybe something called the Casimir force to see how much energy you can produce. We haven't really tapped into that, but we know there are things out there. It's just like, how much further is it going to go? I was always a big Trekkie growing up. Star Trek, like it was like a sort of cultural thing for me, and it like sort of helped stimulate my overactive imagination when I wasn't throwing acorns at buses and things like that in the Vermont back roads. I remember years and years ago they had a whole storyline about taking a dead planet that's lifeless and somehow terraforming it. And suddenly it becomes this lush tropical paradise. I thought, wow, that's amazing. Like, but maybe that's hundreds of years into the future that we could do something like that. Well, surprisingly, I learned that there are quite a number of scientists at serious universities around the world today that actually are working on terraforming projects. Questioning, like, could we, for instance, terraform Mars? Elon Musk is someone who thinks that we could, right?
He hates AI, though.
Yeah, he hates AI. Well, yeah, but he actually has his way of addressing his fear of AI is for us to merge with it, which he's formed a company called Neuralink, where you can basically connect directly with your AI. This is also accelerating our ability to discover stuff. I myself have a brain-computer interface at home, and we've had it for years. My kids put it on their head, and they can actually manipulate things on my computer with their thoughts. And those types of devices are being developed so that you can access the web directly, or if you, instead of like asking Alexa or some other personal assistant that you would have, you'd be able to intracranially access the world's information. In what ways are those skills, those tools, those abilities going to accelerate discovery of new things? So on the one hand, it really is like a gloomy picture of like world problems. And yet there seems to be this shrinkage between like the problem and maybe a potential solution that's occurring. Whereas in the past, we might wait like hundreds of years for those things to occur. It is starting to accelerate the pace such that you can imagine we'll create new problems, but maybe the solution for addressing those new problems will arrive much faster. And if it goes fast enough, maybe the problem and the solution are almost simultaneous to one another. And I actually use the example of the common cold. For a long time, it was thought like we'll never come up with a cure for the common cold, and that is also a sci-fi narrative in Star Trek. In the future, they still haven't figured out the common cold because it keeps mutating. It's a problem. Well, MIT created a camera that takes 1 trillion photographs per second. You would say, okay, that's maybe a little too much, wedding photography. What are you going to do with that, right? 1 trillion photos. You want to capture every moment, but seriously, 1 trillion photos per second may be a bit much. So you can actually watch metabolic processes happening within cells in real time when you use a computer to render that 1 trillion photos per second. You can watch thoughts propagate in the neural network of the mind in real time, like slowed down so that we can perceive them. So you can actually see the common cold in its mutations and actually get ahead of it with the computer, which no one would have ever thought possible if you didn't see this. So what that's evidencing in my mind is that, yes, we are going to create new environmental problems. We have tons we probably don't even know about, but we're also getting these new powerful tools. The problem in my mind really is there's a gap between those in the know and those not in the know. As William Gibson, who's sort of the self-proclaimed sci-fi cyberpunk founding father, once quipped in Economist magazine, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. That there are what we call information asymmetries. And it seems like very often those in government are the least in the know. And one of the things that really horrifies me, and I actually went and spoke before the state education committee about this. We were sort of talking about adoption of technology, and it's really bad in government. A few years ago, the stat was we spent on the order of $94 billion on information technology at the federal level in government. And, $86 billion on information technology, which is not so much as a percentage of the overall budget. But what was really alarming is 94% of those expenditures represented projects that were over budget or behind schedule, and 40% never saw the light of day. And the really alarming thing is if our nuclear arsenal still runs on not 6-inch but 8-inch floppy disks from the 1970s. No. Supposedly they're going to get upgraded at some point, but those huge floppy disks, the 8-inch ones, like I guess it's good if you tried to break in and hack it. You can't, because who's carrying around an 8-inch floppy disk to try to get into the system? It's so primitive. Who would ever think, right? But that's true today at the federal. Like, we don't, as government, do very well with innovation. We just don't. It's true on state level in general. It's not. Currently, like if you look at just renewables, the split is about a 60-40 split, which is actually good because 60% is now coming from the private sector and 40% is public initiatives that happen.
Do you think it needs to go up for it to
I would like to see it more from I would like to see the government step back and allow competition to accelerate. My biggest concern, and this is actually a good place to segue into like the conversation for today, one of the real questions is about the subsidies that we have. And there's so much strange information out there. I won't call it disinformation because that's already to take a political stand on some of it, but confusing information that's out there. Just before coming here today, I did like a recent search to ask how much subsidies go to fossil fuels from the government every year. And I saw quotes on one website, it said $20 billion a year. On another website, it said $70 billion a year. And Al Gore said it's 40 times what's spent on renewables every single year. So the subsidies that go to renewables supposedly are a small subset. Other critiques have said, well, but some of that includes like what we spend with our military securing certain import channels for fossil fuels, let's say in the Middle East and other parts of the world. So that adds to it. I don't really care if it's 20 or 70 billion. It's a lot. It's a lot. And in general, I would like to see the removal of subsidies altogether. I think that competition and not crony capitalism or government picking those things is really what moves things forward. But often you do have these blocks. And it can be because the government like has a no-compete bid with a certain company, and they come in and they say, all right, we're going to supply your solar power, and we'll put in a solar farm in your town. Is that really the most efficient way of doing it? Is that the most cost efficient? Is that the most cutting-edge technology? Or have we picked and chose winners as opposed to as private citizens? That's an open question. I'd like to hear what people have to say about it. Along the same lines, since you mentioned sort of fossil fuel companies trying to buy up technology, that we know that there have been some great inventions over time that would cut back on fossil fuel emissions, or even just take us to better tech. I frankly don't care what your reasons are as long as we get off oil. If you're just happy with future fuels that are going to be clean and cheaper and better in every way, I'm okay with that. If it's because of environmental stuff, that's okay too. It's as long as we just get off of oil. Whatever road takes us there, I'm very pragmatic on that, and that's why I try to like cast a big tent over it. But one of the things I've spoken to people in the patent legal side of things, I have a friend who runs a patent firm down in New York City, and we've tried to talk about changing how our patents work. When the patent office was started, way back when, the number of patents issued every year was very small because the innovation was small. Now it's so enormous they can't handle it, and they're starting to outsource it. And one of the things that's also happening as a consequence, you could have fossil fuel company buy up a great technology and bury it for the time being, right? It's not being used. So my friend has submitted that there should be a legal change in the patent system whereby there are different tiers of patents. Some have lengthy review, and some have like our simple issued patents. They're maybe not going to change the world. Like software. Most software is already out of date within 6 months. Do you really need to issue a patent that's meant to go for years and years and take the same amount of time? Maybe not, right? That's one kind of interesting question. My own view of this is it should be for things that could be for the good of humanity, there should be a use it or lose it type of patent. You have a certain number of years to use a new technology that you own. And if you don't, frankly, you then have to share that patent. You still can have an economic slice of it, but you have to then open it up in a kind of commons way for other people to use. I think that would be an interesting way. So I'm sort of curious, when it comes to the practical deployment of new things, what do people think? I'd like to sort of hear, because Vermont, it's a little bit of a debate and discussion. We've had these incentives built in the form of subsidies for certain types of energy technology. We've also, as a nation, been in, having subsidies for oil. I'm kind of interested to hear what as a group everyone thinks of it, because a lot of what we're doing as an organization is like doing some listening around the state and trying to sort of assess like what's in people's minds, and to crowdsource ideas for how to better illustrate this. So I don't know if anyone's had any thought on that, or if you've encountered up close and incredibly personally these types of things, these decisions, and what kind of factors have been of interest to you when it comes to like moving in a new direction in terms of energy, and if it's environment, if it's cost, what factors are most meaningful.
I mean, I don't know about the SAUL technology and the nuclear reactor you're talking
about.
Oh, yeah,
sure. Yeah.
For me, nuclear power is just a clear no.
Yep.
Like, I'm interested in innovation, like that's great, but I mean, look at Fukushima. We don't even know what's going on there. And like, I'm not confident that humans are going to be around in 4.5 million years, like the half-life uranium, to monitor that waste. And I care about other life on Earth, So like, we're not going to bring back the dodo from any kind of technology, We've already gone too far in some ways.
Well, if you've seen Jurassic Park, believe it or not, there is efforts right now to bring back extinct plants and wildlife. And some of that's using somatic nuclear transfer. There's actually, years ago, I was following a project that actually happened in Israel near the area known as Masada. There was a certain plant that's thought to have been extinct for 1,000 years. They found seeds that they were able to basically reboot for the first time, and those plants are growing now in Israel for the first time in 1,000 years. They've done similar things with like a lion. It was like a lion or tiger, I think, that they found one in a jar in some university, and it's been extinct, this particular species, since 1930, and they were able to fertilize an embryo and implant it in a mouse womb, and it grew until it exceeded the size of the mouse room, and I call it the mouse that roared, like it couldn't do it. But it's the first time that you've seen like a biological process booted up on that. So that's already, I'm not so sure that's 100% the case. Interestingly, I agree with the nuclear waste being a huge problem. Some of the new nuclear has, first of all, designs that don't require anyone to be here in even 1 year or 1 day, let alone 4 million years, to address like controlling how those reactions work. They will shut themselves down. They have far less waste that they produce. But the latest designs for future fusion reactors, one of the things that those things could also do is actually remediate old nuclear waste from other reactors. France, for instance, uses like spent nuclear fuel rods for some of its nuclear power plants itself. So there's a way of also reducing volumetrically by a very significant amount nuclear waste. There's perhaps things on the horizon for remediating it entirely without having to wait that whole period of time. But in the past, you're correct. Like those would not be
still out on an island, like seeping out.
Right. And like by design, that was totally flawed. Most of our nuclear plants have been poorly designed. One of the things that was most shocking is they had no robotics in place to deal with the meltdown that they experienced over there. They had to wait while it was sent to them to do that. Today, that would be like incomprehensible to have that kind of thing.
But
So
it does beg the question, what he was saying, that we've got these nuclear waste presently that are going to be a burden on all future generations.
Unless we can create fusion that would get rid of it.
Why can't we just put that? Why can't we put those dollars and that energy, that focus on something that we know from the get-go is not going to create why not get solar energy completely out there and just totally disregard nuclear?
Well, this is where I make a distinction between research and innovation and actual deployment. And I even think with solar, we've built a lot of solar projects that in just a few years will be obsolete. We've spent money on things that we're going to find that tech has already been overcome. And maybe we would have been better off, it's an open question, would we have been better off investing that money in research and development? Because we know when it's cheaper than anything else, the adoption rate will accelerate. And even now, there's like very clever ways for getting it out there easier. There's several companies now that can use virtual reality or augmented reality to teach you how to install solar panels, because there's a huge problem in many parts of the US. There's no one trained to do it. It's a huge problem. So they're using VR and AR to try to trap that.
That's one of the things that Bill McKibben talks about. And also, I don't know if you know that book, The Greening of the Global Economy.
Yes. Yep.
And so one of the things they were saying is that solar power is such a jobs generator, because you are going to need to have people to install them, maintain them in your house. You can't outsource that anywhere. It does mean local job creation.
Right. For right now. Yeah. Again, I live 10 years in the future. I'm a time traveler. So the question is, will it mean that 10 years from now? It might right now, but will it? So for instance, there are plans... 10 years from now,
I'll be 67 and I'm not getting up there on myself.
We only care about right now. So actually, one of the trends in solar, we install 5.5 billion meters of glass a year worldwide in construction. That's an outrageous amount. It's currently possible using a nano technology engineered material to have that glass not only have great insulating capabilities, because we spend an inordinate amount of our power on heating and cooling, HVAC, which itself can be dropped precipitously. There's already tech that could wipe out maybe 20% of what we spend on that. That's huge in terms of global output of power, right? So there's a company, there's actually several companies working with the glass, but there's one company in particular that already can generate 30 watts of electricity for every meter of glass there, and they think in just the coming months that'll be 50 watts. So you can really have an edifice complex, like the whole surface of your building. There are certain buildings that the entire surface constitutes solar, so it's not necessarily going to always be something extra on top of what we currently have. I mentioned before the aesthetic element, which is also a limitation. I think it's something that calls for a design challenge, frankly. I love old, right here in Woodstock, old Vermont colonials, slate roofs and the like. Wouldn't it be great if solar can really be the biomimicry we'd like it to be, like the leaves of the trees, or disappear from sight altogether? Isn't that the ultimate a trajectory of technology, to kind of disappear from sight? You don't see it. And efforts are being made. There are already like numerous solar roof projects. Tesla's like at the forefront of that, having solar roofs where the tiles can actually look more or less like your roofing tile. They're blended in. They're $42 for a square foot instead of 11, but it's still, the payback time keeps shrinking. In certain parts of the world, it's 3 or 4 years for a payback, and there's a little bit of a delay, but this is iteration 1. What will 5 years of this exponential thing do to that? Will we be able to have paints, for instance, that accomplish that? Already you can buy photophilic paints, by the way, where if you get a scratch on your car, your house, you shine light on it and the paint regrows, just like your skin heals from a cut. So can you have a coating that's photophilic that's also photovoltaic on your house, and if it gets damaged with a scratch, it just self-heals, so your solar is self-repairing, and it's the entire house. In France, in Normandy, France, they have 1 kilometer of road that for a little over $5 million, it's road solar. The road itself is solar. It's, instead of taking up fields or other, surfaces that currently, we would have vegetation there, we've got a tremendous amount of roadway. Here in the US also, they did it a little bit on Route 66, and there's about 100 solar road projects that we have in the world. So I think some of these things will disappear, but I do think we want to include all of these types of technology. I'd even include antimatter, which was a totally crazy thing to even talk about. You'd be laughed out of the university if you mentioned antimatter a few years ago, because you couldn't hold on to it for very long. Like fractions of a second, like femtoseconds, talking about like trillionths of a second, quintillionths of a second, you could sustain antimatter in the world. And the amount of energy that stuff has in it is mind-boggling. Now some of it's been held on to for like, many seconds. Still not many minutes, but many seconds. Starting to make people wonder, whoa, if we can bring down the cost of antimatter, which would be, like billions and billions per ounce to a few $1,000s an ounce through technology, could that be a source of power that, again, is not generating like radioactive waste and the like, because that all annihilates itself in the reaction that it has.
Do you think we're near fusion?
I do think we're closer to fusion than many people think. I do think that's a possibility, partly because we can experiment with the modeling in ways that weren't possible before.
Right, that's through artificial intelligence.
Yeah, the artificial intelligence. You can just work through that. Even with materials, we used to be sort of confined to like natural occurring materials. We now have two things that have occurred that many people don't realize. For the first time, we have what's called mechanical synthesis that can happen in material science, which is the ability to pluck and place individual atoms in any configuration or arrangement you want. I can take this atom and place it right here in a lattice of other atoms, allowing me to make custom novel materials that have never happened, including a whole class called metamaterials that can do things like Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility, right? Like really bizarre properties that don't exist in the natural world can be now created because of this precision. Prior to the last couple of years, working with materials was like a Jackson Pollock painting. You would just splatter the paint and hope some of it hit the canvas kind of in the area you wanted it to go, because you couldn't really control where individual atoms went. You couldn't pick a specific atom and put it in a specific place. You would just throw paint and hope that some of it stuck, right? That's changed. The last few years, we've now achieved mechanical synthesis. There's the ability to resolve individual atoms using electron force microscopes for the first time. So already in nanotechnology, you have objects that are trillions of atoms in size that have been atomically precise engineered. They can replicate themselves billions of times in a very short span of period. And there are projects for then going and like breaking down trash in landfills. Could we take all of our garbage and create what's called the new alchemy? The new alchemy is really closer than I think anyone realized. Robert Friedrich Jr. is one of the big prophets of nanotechnology, suggests that we are maybe only 15 years away from a desktop nano replicator. And this is taking what FabLab technology has done with 3D printing and laser cutting, basically additive and subtractive manufacturing technologies to the next level. So when we think about waste and recycling, it changes things quite profoundly. I think about like my kids and the amount of waste that they would make when they were little growing up. So there's all the plastic stuff, but then there are like all the toys and the like. And now you can for very little money, you can go out and get a 3D printer, and you could print out those Legos that your grandchild or your great-grandchild or your child or whoever it is likes to play with, right? You can have those Legos, and you can print them out in your own home, and when you're done playing with them, you melt them down. You don't have to store the stuff, and you make forks and knives for lunch out of the printer next. Then you melt those down, you make Legos again or something else. That technology is already here today, and the cost of 3D printing in just the last 7 years has come down from $40,000 to $100 per constant performance. That's an enormous deflationary cost curve. Same thing with laser cutting, which is again
just to do a hologram and not have the actual object. Just think you have it.
Well, that's what virtual reality or mixed reality or augmented reality are doing. They're allowing you to have the virtual experience of those things, to play with them, and then you don't have to have the thing. That allows us to do more with less in terms of like waste right now. If you have a computer today that you buy at Staples, it's probably got at least a 1 terabyte hard drive. Well, I love physical books, but 1 tera, just in terms of rich text format, that displaces the paper from 50,000 that would come from 50,000 trees. 1 terabyte of hard drive storage. So we keep finding ways of doing more with less through these types of technologies. Yeah.
So one of the big issues is, this was an issue in New York City, and it's also an issue here, is trying to figure out local food production, because after World War II, moved everybody off the farms, centralized in California. Central Valley was now on fire. It was the food basket. So like, what technologies do you see helping sustain local?
So that has a huge impact on the environment. In fact, flying over Sao Paulo, Brazil in a helicopter a few years ago, I was just aghast at what I saw. It makes New York City look small, just an ocean of skyscrapers. And I thought, wow, if like the power went, and you couldn't get food in here, these people will starve to death. What will you do? And we were involved with a project having to do with space hacking. How do you make a micro apartment that's maybe 900 square feet feel like it's 3 times that size? Maybe it's 600 square feet. Really, really small apartments expand. And so we were constantly looking at ways to do more with less. And one of the things is making projects where you have a high rise of 60 stories, let's say, and you want to make it eco-friendly. So we looked at, for instance, could you generate power when you flush the toilet? There's little turbines as it goes down 60 stories, generates power in the building. And the answer is yes, you can. Just about everything in the building can frankly capture power. And some of that's becoming economically viable. So it was astonishing to see. One of the things we thought is food production, because currently we transport it. It'd be nice to be able to do it locally and have options. So we looked at vertical farms, like putting up a 60-story tower of food production where you got corn growing on the 75th to the 81st floor, right there in the middle of the city. And there are projects like that underway right now. But what was even more interesting is giving people personal freedom over food production. And there are projects like at MIT that allow you to have roboticized mini micro greenhouses that actually will use very little soil and very little water. They're extremely economical, and you can have in your garage or in your living room a few bookcases, and each one is growing different things for you year round. And the degree in which you can automate that increases, including their 3D printing attachments that plant the seed and then throw in a little injection fertilizer, and then a little light that's just shining in the exact place and nowhere else where that seed is. You can look at some of these projects.
Why grow it in the future? Why don't we just make it?
Right. So
we already talked about bioengineering.
Yep. That's an area.
Why
so I've given
food anymore?
Why not making it? Yeah. So the types of stuff. One of the areas of research going on now that's very exciting is why not grow everything? There are actually projects. Could we grow a car? Could you grow a house? And if you want your house to be bigger, just grow a new addition to your house. And if the house gets damaged, it regrows itself. Sounds crazy until you consider this little, what the size of an embryo of a blue whale is, and then it turns into this massive creature. So clearly in nature, there's a mechanism whereby something so small, when you apply the right inputs, becomes something quite large and complicated.
Well, why have a house anymore?
Why not a house?
We could have a suit of clothing.
Right, you could.
That would be an environment. We wouldn't
you
need
could,
a house.
you
we
could
have through virtual reality. We could have the appearance.
There's, by the way, already a watch that has a band on it that puts stimulus right onto your nerve that actually can change your temperature by a few degrees, so you feel just hot or colder based on this stimulation. It's an interesting new startup that has done that of late.
I mean, we send the astronauts into space, and they wear, up at the space station, they wear special suits so that they can go out into negative.
So all of these things are sort of proliferating possibilities that are happening there, and certainly that's happening with food. One area I like to talk about is cultured meat or in vitro meat. And it sounds freaky to a lot of people. I'm actually a huge advocate for it. There's a new company called Memphis Meats, even I'm not supposed to mention company names. And Bill Gates and others are invested in it, and they're growing from cells derived from an animal. They grow steak basically. And it sort of started out at $2,400 a pound. Probably not going to get that at Stop and Shop, but it's coming down in price like no tomorrow. And a lot of this has to do with tissue engineering. So we'll be able to grow meat without it even deriving from an animal product altogether, and maybe we give it better health. Nutrition benefits associated with that meat or that types of food. There are a lot of projects going on like that, but that also reduces strain on the environment and the ability to feed more people with less land mass. And you know, every one of these components factors into what we'll be able to do in the future in terms of sustaining population and affecting pollution. So yes, I would definitely investigate some of the amazing things that are going on in hacking food. That certainly is worth looking into.
I heard Ray Kurzweil a few years ago talk about that people could live. He said something like, "If I could live 20 more years, I could live forever." And so they had people in the context of that saying, "We know how to do a lot of things, but we don't." You know, that is because we're emotional and irrational, and so often he had people on his staff who would come and give him vitamins and supplements at different times of the day so that he would maintain the possibility for living a long time. But so I think that's in a way humanity at large, from proportionate to Kurzweil. I think the hard part is to imagine. One of the hard parts is it seems like you imagine that there's so much innovation and the force is just going that way, and that's the way things are going to go.
Right.
And but the other side is that people are so selfish and stupid that that's a big. There's a lot of momentum in that inertia in that direction.
I'd like to pick up on that a little bit. That's what's been concerning me.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill Gates is not president. Look at the administration that we have. You started out by talking about polarization, and that's such a huge issue, because we have our emotions, our urges, fear, people that don't want to know, stress, you know, the ones that know, the ones that don't, the ones that think about humanity, and the ones that just think about how they can, you know, amass the most from them because someone else might try to take it. You know, basic kind of primitive things that we're actually dealing with. You know, here we are, we're so smart, but yet look at the administration we have right now. So, you know, we have to think about that. Who has the power? Who decides? Who values? You know, we all have, who gives weight to what values? You know, and people come up with completely different decisions. You know, that's, you know, like it's like you have the polarization. You know. And you know, and that's what's always hung us up. Right. It's not the knowledge, you know. It's our values and our emotions and our kind of our psychological needs, our developmental problems. You know, how do we forward that? You know, how do we we need the balance. You know, how do we do that? But somebody's got to make the decision.
There's a cost to the innovation, and it seems to be in terms of relationality. Yeah. And that's a mental health problem.
It's a mental health problem. There's fear. There's such fear of change, of stress, of the other, of the different. You know, people don't want to think.
I would submit to you that all of our anchors of personal identity are being uprooted right now. And that is destabilizing.
Yes,
and what I like to try to do is just expose people to sort of like what's already going on, because the more we're acquainted with it, the more we realize what is possible around the corner, the more we can try to accelerate the acceleration towards those things and make sure they become good outcomes and not negative outcomes. And unquestionably, we're going to have more problems along the way, problems we haven't even encountered, and yet by many standards, like, things are better than they've ever been before in the world. And some of that has been articulated by the likes of Steven Pinker in his book, The Angels of Our Better Nature. The world is less violent, the literacy rates are up more than they are, and there are like kind of limitations, but I think what will drive people towards these better ends is seeing what the promise of these things are, and doing that educationally. When I go around and speak, I speak to a lot of college students, I even sometimes speak to high school students, and I'm shocked they're just not aware of even what's going on in the world today, looking for jobs. So for instance, in the last couple of years, to me, one of the most innovative and mind-blowing things has hardly been reported on in the mainstream press. You would think everyone would be talking about it in school. We're talking much more about celebrity gossip than we are about this other stuff. And this gets into Kurzweil's thing about longevity. So in just the last few years, there's been great strides made with gene editing, particularly with what's known as the CRISPR-Cas9 system. CRISPR stands for clustered, regularly interspersed short palindromic repeats. It is basically an advanced way of editing the human genome. It has some hiccups associated with it. It's already gone through new iterations, and there are alternative versions that have already been put forth. But in essence, it allows for single nucleotide edits of the human genome. Currently, we think there is a catalog of somewhere in the order of 50,000 known diseases. Of those 50,000, about 32,000 are monogenetic, meaning it's like one spelling mistake in a book, one letter is misspelled in the whole book. And if you can target that one letter and correct it, you would uproot theoretically those 32,000 diseases. CRISPR has the potential to do that. CRISPR has already been used in human trials for certain things, including things related to cancer. And yet most Americans have never heard of this. The most amazing thing about CRISPR, I find, is not only its efficacy, but its cost. It took what was very expensive gene editing in like the $1 million range to set it up. Now you can have a basic CRISPR system for like $2,000. It's like really inexpensive to do this.
That a small group can genetically modify whatever they want.
And so that relates to something called biopunk. Biopunk is a movement of like kids out of high school who are buying wetware on Craigslist, basically basic biolab equipment. They can mail order, FedEx overnight, base pairs of DNA, and they are creating plants that smell like vanilla extract when they need to be watered. Goldfish that are everything but gold in color, like fruity colors that are sold in some pet stores. It's illegal in certain states, others unregulated. And this is what's going on. And yet, like if you were to ask people, like, I don't even know what that is, So there's this huge gap between sort of what's possible and what we're aware of, and there are great responsibilities, obviously, related to all this stuff. That's why I feel like these kinds of conversations have to happen more in communities.
So one of the things, I talk to a lot of people because I work in a bunch of fields that use AI, and I talk to a lot of people and they say they adamantly hate AI. They hate the notion of AI as they take out their phone and they put it in their thumbprints, or have their photos, automatically.
They do their online checking with
and they tell Siri, So I think that what they're saying, I guess we don't necessarily recognize the progress that we're making.
Yeah.
Like we use an iPhone that uses 5 or 6 disciplines that I can name off of different types of AI. And so we don't necessarily recognize the improvements that we are exactly like that. Like like kids are actually selling a product that
we don't recognize the hazards that are being created either at the same time.
And yet our ability to respond to those hazards is accelerating too. That's why actually jobs are going. Part of what I like to do is go around Vermont talking about future jobs. We want to keep our youth here. How do we do that? Many of the jobs people have had in past generations, they kind of look, well, what did my parents do, or my parents' parents? Right. Those jobs aren't going to exist, and we're also not educating for that. And yet all these new issues that you're talking about, those are future jobs. Jobs in cybersecurity, biotech security, all of these kinds of things are areas that are unaddressed. So I've gone into communities in Vermont. We've talked about how we now have over 25 farms that are fully robotic in their milking operation here in Vermont today. The cows walk in, the robots clean them up, descend on them, milk them, feed them at the same time, whisper in their ear, and then send them on their way with no one involved. That's right now in Vermont. And it's growing by leaps and bounds. In my town, logging is a big thing. There, John Deere has a logging robot that's this like big crane arm, and it grabs a tree, saws it off, uses a ring saw to divest it of its branches and leaves, and then cuts it into neat, log lengths and loads it on the truck, all autonomously. That thing can work at night, at any time of year by itself, and do the work of 20 lumberjacks. Like, these are really relevant conversations that you don't get from it's not the focus of the media. It's like we'd much rather yell at each other over, you know, other kinds of policy.
And why is that? Why is that? We need to ask ourselves some things.
It's really important. That's why I think we have to have the quality conversation. Reality is very tough.
Like what Trump's, you know, whole thing is to distract people. You know?
Yeah, it's all distraction.
Yeah,
distraction. Because why? Why is it all? Why do we get into that? Much distraction.
Well, because we
love distraction.
Yeah.
And our current political is all about entertainment.
Yes.
And we live in a world where, I mean, most of us probably here don't even know how to fix our cars, much less our phones.
Right.
And so when we live in a world where we can't understand the things that we get at Best Buy, we need entertainment to supplant that. And first we had, we had YouTube recently, but now we have beyond YouTube, we have total entertainment, which includes the political environment.
Yeah, and
so I think that's the success of it.
They're just addicted
and Trump
to
is
entertainment.
Trump is the perfect
reality
representation
show.
of it.
Our government is a reality show.
It is.
Yeah, it's just entertainment.
And so when they say when our politicians say, you know, fracking is a bridge to the future, we need this kind of stuff. I mean, how does the citizenry get up there and say, well, no, we don't, right?
Right.
Well, how do you make democracy even work?
There are some very helpful. Another area I speak to is future of government, and actually there are some really promising things even happening in government. As much as it drives me nuts, I know it's very hard to say this, especially because I've been very frustrated from it. I've had to detox from it for years, and generally I like private initiatives, and private initiatives don't necessarily mean venture capital. It can mean that. It can sometimes mean just grassroots efforts that are happening in local communities. And the question is, like, how do you combine that with government? So one of the most sort of interesting things in recent years has happened in the Boston area. I don't know about you, but I remember the Big Dig for years, making Boston hell on earth to try to traverse because it just was under construction for like millennia, it felt like, right? And for all the ineptitude that was associated with that problem in Boston, they've now adopted certain things in what we call open government, where like private initiatives can come from citizens to say, like, fix a problem without having the government to try to do it top down in a bureaucratic way. So one of those is like an app that if you're in the area, you can download on your phone. And it's called tongue-in-cheek the pothole app, and it uses the accelerometer on your phone. So if you're driving in Boston, you go over a pothole, your phone actually registers it. You don't have to do anything. It's running silently in the background, and it uses the GPS coordinates to say that's on the corner of Elm and Spruce, you know. And if enough phones in enough cars register that, they know it's not, you know, somebody left something on the street. There's probably a pothole there. They dispatch a road crew to go fill it. If you were to try to send someone working for the government around to survey all the roads with regularity to fill the potholes, it'd be very expensive. They did the same thing with fire hydrants. There's no mechanism in Boston for digging out fire hydrants after a snowstorm. Now, I don't know about you, but in recent memory, I recall Boston being buried in snow, right? So try finding a fire hydrant when you need one if there's a fire after like 2.5 feet of snow in Boston. There's no one charged with doing that. So they gamified it. They created an online like game board with all the fire hydrants on it. And they said, basically, if you see one, you can adopt it. And you adopt it and you get to name it. You can call it by whatever you want, and it's your little fiefdom, that fire hydrant, as long as you shovel it out after every snowstorm. Believe it or not, people bought into it and have done it, just out of like a sense of civic responsibility. And if you forget to shovel it out, you lose it, then your competitors can claim your territory and gain the fire hydrant. So this is one of like dozens of projects, and actually, interestingly, and this is a sort of bipartisan thing, both the Obama administration that initiated and the Trump administration who continue it have something called the U.S. Digital Service. I love things that are bipartisan. They're very rare. So it's great if you can find something that actually works. So what started the U.S. Digital Service? As many know, the healthcare.gov website cost an extreme amount of money. You see estimates into the billions and didn't work. And it got like entangled and all knotted up and no one knew what to do with it. So the Obama administration created the U.S. Digital Service, which was dubbed a kind of bubble within the White House whereby certain people from the outside could come in, and there's sort of been called a Peace Corps for nerds. And it's usually 20-somethings armed with, the knowledge that comes from working at Oracle or IBM or Amazon or Google or Facebook, one of these types of companies. And they brought in a small team, and they said they gave them plenty of air coverage, meaning they removed all the regulatory and bureaucratic meshes and just said, fix this. And in a matter of weeks, for basically free, they fixed the website. This was so successful that it's now been done on all kinds of other projects, like Code for America is another one. They found with websites for benefits for our veterans, there were almost 1,000 websites being mismanaged by the federal government, resulting in extreme wait times to go in for, let's say, a medical checkup or to get any of your benefits as a veteran. So as a result, they brought in, again, a team of just 6 people. They were handed ancient laptops running Windows XP from 1999. They said, this will not work. We're requisitioning new equipment. That was the first thing they did. And also, in a matter of weeks, they reduced almost 1,000 websites to 1. And the wait time for getting in for a medical appointment for our veterans shrunk from like months and months and months to just days or weeks as a result of doing that. So this is an experiment in open government. I talk a lot about open government. Open government doesn't mean bringing in like we're going to hire Microsoft to fix our governmental problem. It means allowing the greater public to crowdsource expertise wherever it may come from, which may be well-qualified individuals that don't work in the government. As many corporations have noted, the smartest people in the world don't work for your company. So it also stands to reason that not all the smart people in the world work in your administration. And I find it amazing that this not only was created by the Obama administration, but it's continued and expanded under the Trump administration. So part of what I like, because we can get so buried in the negative on politics. And I was in plenty of circles where I heard Obama bashed all the time because I run the whole spectrum with people that I've seen in my network. And I'd rather, how can we make our leaders, this is sort of a question I have, how can we make our leaders the best leaders they can potentially be? How can we find maybe that one little thing that someone's doing that's good? And the fact that here's something, the U.S. Digital Service, that as different as they are, Trump and Obama, they're both doing this. To me, that's like a place to begin to have a conversation and maybe something worth thinking about. But a lot of people aren't even aware of open government as a movement and what it's doing to, again, do more with less. Usually the political alternatives is we can do more with more, or we can sometimes do less with more, or we can do less with less, right? Those are sort of like the 3 choices you get. Rarely do you get someone saying we can do more with less. So like I'll come and I'll tell people, like, my view is I want to give the whole world better health care than any billionaire in the world can have today. And I want to make it cost a teeny fraction of what we currently spend on healthcare. And people usually look at me like I'm nuts. Until you start thinking about how like CRISPR is like $2,000 instead of $1 million, for gene editing, and you can do a human genome now for less money than flushing a toilet. When you start to see what technological disruption does, maybe we could get to that place. And it's not an either-or situation. I don't see that part of the conversation at all. And that's why we're having these conversations, to sort of like mix these ideas, to get feedback and push back and all those types of things. But hopefully we have a more nuanced conversation. And I think we're out of time. We've gone a little bit over here, but I really appreciate all of you coming. And I hope you will consider maybe coming to other events. We've spoken a little bit, maybe the library doing one of our thought exchanges if you want to do some political speed dating. As long as we can get a balance of views in the room, that's where it's most effective. So we don't just speak to the like ones people.
TV for coming out to record us.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, man. Good job.